Good morning. It's a nice response. I want to thank Brother Johnny for being in here last week. And while I had some dental work done, I was here but could not talk very well. So thank you for that. He had a great lesson as we were studying Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah got started in Nehemiah. In the background there, and just really enjoyed his class. So today we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 4. If you'd like to turn in your Bibles, Nehemiah chapter 4. So he gave a great background for Ezra and Nehemiah, the books, what are contained in the books, as the exiles are returning from their captivity. So like the first settlers who accompanied Zerubbabel and Jeshua coming back to Israel, Nehemiah and his company faced opposition as well. So Nehemiah's first task was to get organized. And so he began by surveying the city. You remember the story from last week where they went at night. They went at nighttime, they went to the gates, they looked at the walls to figure out what was going to be involved in the project, see what kind of effort was going to be needed. You know, I don't know that we talked, I guess it would be speculation on why it was at night. Perhaps he didn't want to stir up a lot of questions before, he was ready. So he went at nighttime, he and his entourage to do this thing. Might be he was so dedicated and focused on the job. I don't know if we mentioned previously when he talked to Artaxerxes and got the approval to come, Artaxerxes asked for him to give a timeline of how long he was going to be there, how long it would take. So perhaps with that in his mind, he was ready to get started just as quickly as possible. At any rate, we talked about that last week, about going to the wall, seeing what all was involved. He really found it was beyond what he had expected as far as the way of damage. But the people who were with him, that had been there, they were used to not having the defenses, but they were all behind him in rebuilding the wall. But throughout chapter 3, we won't cover chapter 3, but chapter 3, Nehemiah assigned the people from the various areas of Judah to work on sections of the wall. And presumably, they would build their houses where they worked. That was one presumption somebody made. But he wanted them to build a strong and secure place and reestablish Jerusalem as a walled city. And he had the king's letter and king's authorization to do this. But it took the people of the land who had been living there some time to realize really what was going on. But when they did, they really tried to undermine Nehemiah's and Judah's and work, the Jews' work, any way that they possibly could. But what they could do was limited because Nehemiah had the authorization of the king to do this. And Nehemiah's enemies, they took it upon themselves to really set up as much obstruction as they possibly could. And really, they reached a line, we'll see today, where they tried to obstruct as much as they could, but ended up having to back off because they realized that Nehemiah had this authorization from the king, from the emperor, to do this. But today we're going to see Sanballat and Tobiah, and they feared the Persian power that reigned over the land and over the empire, but the Persian power still was based in perhaps Susa, where Nehemiah came from as the king's cupbearer, or it might have been perhaps in Babylon. At any rate, that was a long way away. So no one was going to go back daily and give reports back to the king about what was going on. But as bold as their enemies might be, the Jews had to be careful as they were doing this project. Before they could rebuild, they had to clean up. It was just the whole walls, the town was just rubble. And cleaning up in itself was no small task. Some of the returnees became deeply discouraged by the effort. We're going to see that. But even without opponents trying to stop the Jews, it really would have been a daunting task. I don't know how many of you had a chance to travel. Kay and I had the opportunity to go to Europe when we were younger on a conference. It wasn't something that we just spur of the moment did, but it was at a conference to attend that was very much blessed by being able to do that. But it was in Germany, and we took a few days, toured Germany, and one thing that struck us, we would see these mounds of concrete, of debris, and we asked somebody, well, what is that? What is that? Where did it come from? And it was still the remaining rubble from World War II, where they had bombed the cities. And in part of the cleanup, they made these gigantic mounds of concrete and debris. So in the time of Nehemiah, they had Jerusalem as a city was just leveled in rubble. And so the first thing they had to do was just get rid of the rubble and clean it up. And as you think about, projects that you may have, we have projects around the house. First thing is really to get things cleaned up and in order so you can move ahead. That's not the most exciting part of your project. So that cleanup was not really, during that time, they were pretty despondent. They were despairing because here we are, this is such a big task. We've got to clean this up first, but we haven't even started to work on the wall yet. So we see that through the courage and determination of Nehemiah, that he organized the people, allowed that work to continue and get to a point where they could get the wall built. So few had experienced the obstacles that the Jews had experienced. The Babylonians, they razed that proud city to rubble. They just leveled it. The Jews returned to Jerusalem from exile. They brought perhaps farming equipment with them that was suitable for the Euphrates Valley where they were and not suitable for the dry hills of Judah and Jerusalem. But farmland of any kind had to be secured because it was at risk. But in these years that had passed since Nebuchadnezzar and other people moved into Judah, there were Edomites and Arabs and others. So they had moved into the area. There was less rain, it was less fertile in this area than in Judah and west of Jerusalem. But to add to everything else, the Persians during this time had appointed their own administration. The local people felt threatened when Zerubbabel and Nehemiah arrived with these crowds of exiles that were coming back to their homeland. And the locals didn't remember when Jerusalem was a mighty city. It was ruled by kings, and we talked about David and Solomon and how grand an empire that was. But these people only knew the land wasn't going to be theirs if things continued to develop as they were developing. So with that as a little bit of background, let's read Nehemiah chapter 4. Let's read the first 6 verses there. Yes. That's a good point. They took ownership of that section of wall, again, perhaps where they were going to be living, where they lived, their houses, and that they took ownership of that as Nehemiah assigned those areas, and that helped, the buy-in, I guess, of the project. It gave them that ownership to the project itself. thank you for that point. So chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. But it so happened, when Sanballat heard that we were building the wall, and this is Nehemiah writing his letter here, that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?" Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, you will break it down their stone wall." So here, Sanballat and Tobiah are mocking them, trying to discourage them, saying, "You're not going to build anything that's going to last. It's going to be rickety. Even if a fox runs up on it, it's going to knock it down." So Nehemiah then responds in prayer. We see in verses 4 and 5. "Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders." Then he continues, verse 6. "So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work." I believe we talked last week, Johnny had a good section about having a mind to work. So there's a unification here. They had a mind to work, to get the project done. So we're seeing these first 6 verses. Just as a little bit of background, to the north and east of Jerusalem was Galilee. The area of Galilee, it was a really desirable landscape. And during the time of Israel, mass numbers of Assyrians had invaded. They Pul, the king of Assyria, he demanded tribute, and Shalmaneser and Sargon laid siege to the area, to Samaria, for 3 years, and finally took it. They carried the Jews into their own kingdom as slaves and servants, and they settled foreigners into the kingdom of Samaria. So again, the Jews were taken away in captivity, and they were replaced with their own citizens. But all this was lots of years, many years before Nehemiah came on the scene. But under Babylon and Persia, these foreigners in the area, they established themselves as Samaritans by the time the Jewish returnees arrived. So under the Persians, Sanballat, who's the main player today in today's story, he was the ruler of Samaria. And his friend Tobiah, he ruled east of the Jordan River, the old territory of the Ammonites. So first, the enemies of the Jews, as they were trying to discourage them, used this idea of mockery to try to undermine them. They mocked them, made fun of them. Sanballat led the way. Did the Jews think they could rebuild the desolate city of Jerusalem? Did they think they would reestablish worship in their temple? And Tobiah added, "If even a fox goes on it, he will break down the stone wall." So again, Nehemiah could only respond in prayer, or this is the way he responded. It was in prayer. And as far as Nehemiah was concerned, this mockery of their opponents, he ignored it. It meant nothing to him because he knew that God was on their side. He had prayed to God as a response to their attacks, and that they would prevail because God was with them. Next few verses there, we're going to start verse 7 through 14. We're going to see this conspiracy that the opponents had put together to try to also discourage them. "Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to God, and because of them we set a watch against them day and night. Then Judah said, 'The strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversaries said," this is the threat that they're making. Verse 11, "And our adversaries said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease." Verse 12, "So it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came that they told us 10 times, from whatever place you turn, they will be upon us. Therefore I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight with your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." So Geshem is mentioned earlier. He was mentioned among these Arabs that were part of the conspiracy in Nehemiah, and he's mentioned later. He's not mentioned in this particular passage. But Arab in this passage, we think is a general designation for those people that lived south and east of Jerusalem. As you think on a map, this would be an area perhaps lived in by the Edomites, by the Ammonites, and this Arab is maybe another term for all those other nations that lived in that area. The Moabites are mentioned in chapter 13. We've already met Sanballat and Tobiah. In the book of Joshua, there are 5 lords of the Philistines: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. And by the time of Nehemiah, the Persians had selected Ashdod as a city, as a seat of government west and south of Jerusalem. But the Samaritans, the Ammonites, the Arabs, the Philistines, they were all welded together as a common hatred of the Jews that were coming back. When they heard that they were making progress on the wall, their sense of loathing increased. They just made them all the more mad, made them all the more hate the Jews in their project as the project continued. And it appears Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, they received mention because they were the instigators for this plot. So they had this plot to destroy the Jews. Mockery was their first step, and it didn't really have any effect on them or discourage them or stop them. You know, as they mocked him, Nehemiah responded in prayer, didn't listen to them, just continued their work. But their enemies decided to try something here a little stronger. They were threatening them. They were more numerous than the Jews, but perhaps they remembered this letter that Nehemiah carried with him, produced from Artaxerxes, and showed that they had the backing of the emperor to do this project. And maybe that is what restrained them to some degree, to keep from doing something even more strong. But perhaps, in their mind, they could at least sow discouragement to the people, have some kind of confusion with them without tipping their hand of what they were doing to try to thwart the project. But they attacked the city. My text said they attacked the city, probably killed a few people. But in the, I'm not sure, from the text that it says that it actually came to pass. I don't know. In the text, it kind of looks like it was a threat to sow discord because, and try to discourage the people. But they almost succeeded in that, in sending the threat, because some of the men of the tribe of Judah, says they pointed out to Nehemiah like 10 times about this plot that perhaps 10 times just mean repeatedly. So there seemed to be this undercurrent. They heard the plot that was being sowed by their enemies. And this group of Jews were repeatedly coming to Nehemiah saying, what are we going to do? We can't do both. It's obviously slowed the work down under this threat of attack. So they couldn't rebuild the walls and stand guard with weapons and do both. They were complaining. So the grumbling did stop. Ultimately, the men of Judah, they continued to complain, but Nehemiah changed his tactics. So in response to this grumbling and to the threat by their enemies, he did a couple of things. One, Nehemiah reinforced the guard at the lower part of the wall. So they had the armed guards basically at the base of the wall. And number two, stationed families to support one another. So we may not be able to follow all the tactical changes that Nehemiah had made to combat this threat, but the plan seemed to have had the desired effect, and Nehemiah began to act more in this point, more of a spiritual leader, as well as a military leader. Because verse 14, he said, "Remember," he said, "the Lord great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and houses." So these steps that Nehemiah took were effective at squelching these threats from their enemies. And one of the things I'm thinking, I'm not sure that Sanballat and Tobiah would be willing to risk going totally against Artaxerxes' order, because they knew that this project was under his direction or his authorization. So that's kind of one reason. I'm not sure what scholars say about, was there really skirmishes? Were there people killed? I'm not sure the answer to that. But in the text, it looks, we don't have any record of actual skirmishes, I don't believe. It's just pretty much a threat that really slowed them down and was meant to discourage them. But we see then, let's start in verse 15, then go forward. "And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us, and that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, every one to his work. So it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at construction, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor, and the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built. And the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me, being Nehemiah. Then I said to the nobles, the rulers, and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us." So we labored in the work, and half of the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. And at the same time I also said to the people, "Let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that every one took them off for washing." So soon enough, the word was out of what Nehemiah had done, what his plan was to combat the threat from the enemies. So Sanballat and Tobiah and those that supported them, they became aware that the Jews knew and knew of their plotting. So God had brought this clever scheme to nothing. The work on the walls continued, and Nehemiah explained that from then on, workmen were divided into two parts. Some of them continued to build the wall. Others, dressed in armor, stood by swords, spears, and bows ready for an attack. And Nehemiah did not have to act alone, though. The men of Judah complained, but the leaders of the people supported him, and the building of the wall was a project requiring everybody to help. So Nehemiah, he really received the support he needed for this project. So Nehemiah says in verse 17, with one hand they worked at construction, and with the other held a weapon. So Nehemiah remained in charge of this undertaking. Beside him, it mentions, kept one who sounded the trumpet, who had a trumpet nearby. So should the enemies attack any part of this project or this endeavor, Nehemiah was to be informed. He in turn called on his assistant to sound the trumpet, and supervisors were informed that they were to respond to the trumpet and set out immediately to fight, be prepared to fight whatever area needed to be defended. Verse 21, so we labored in the work, Nehemiah wrote, and half the men held spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. Nehemiah had the full support of the Jews there before him. He took no credit for himself. He gave all the credit to God for giving them success. But in the last verses here, there's one item that still remained that needs some attention. That is, Jerusalem itself still was a wasteland. You know, they were building the wall. In those days, there was a lot of times they would have living quarters within the wall. So as Max had mentioned, being assigned a section of the wall, that could be where your family lived. You had ownership in that section. But it sounds like the rest of the city was still somewhat of a wasteland. And it had been the habit of the builders to leave the city at night, at the nighttime. And when they did, a couple of things happened. Number one, the wall was left defenseless. You know, it wasn't completed yet. And there was nobody there to defend it if somebody wanted to come in, knock it down, disrupt their previous progress. So that was number one. Number two, there's a psychological effect that this had on the people. You know, it was a reminder that the Jews couldn't stay in the city yet because it had not been rebuilt. So Nehemiah gave this order that the workmen were to stay in the city at night, and he and his lieutenants, they lived under the same rules, so he and his staff continued also to stay in the city and stay there at night. It even says they didn't take their clothes off at night except to wash them. So the walls were guarded day and night until the city was habitable. So Nehemiah became very focused, and he shared that focus with the rest of the group of this. It needs to be our main priority. We need to stay here, defend it, get it completed, with the idea that, you know, we will be able to live in this city again, but if we keep going out at night, it's going to slow us down. We have the risk of them undermining and knocking the wall down of what we've already built. So that's the other piece that he shared and change that he made. So kind of in this conclusion, and we're going to have an application here in just a second, but in this conclusion for this chapter, Nehemiah did not defeat the armies, these nations, and forge out a kingdom for himself like we might think of David and Solomon having done. He was not necessarily a rugged spiritual leader like Jeremiah had been. But Nehemiah was a man of integrity and resolve, and he brought this stalemate that had been going on with the people of Jerusalem to the end, and he brought that to the attention of the emperor of Persia, to Artaxerxes, and he gathered the supplies that were needed to complete the wall, complete the construction, and do the rebuilding. And it was he who put his reputation and his fortune on the line to cause this worship of God to be done in Jerusalem. You know, he had a very, being the cupbearer of Artaxerxes was a very honorable position, very high, well thought out. So I'm sure in that position, you know, he didn't want for anything, and yet he was willing to put his reputation, his name at risk to do this because he saw the need. He knew God's people needed a place to be rebuilt in Jerusalem. He knew it was God's will. So he followed that and did this plan to get those walls rebuilt. Before we go on, is there any comments at this point? When we think about application, and we're reading this chapter, what kind of lessons, we're taking the lessons from Nehemiah, how he dealt with this opposition. And if we apply that today, what are some of the things we can learn? Nehemiah and the Jews, they were doing the Lord's work. They were doing what the Lord wanted, so to speak, yet they were met with these scoffs and opposition and mockery. So today, when we think about our opposition, who or what scoffs and mocks us and opposes us as Christians as we're trying to do the Lord's work? So this is a question for the class. Yes?
I think some of the elements that we see within our society, we don't always frame it this way, but we're engaged in a great cultural war in our civilization where the very moral fibers of our country are being redefined, elements that are ungodly and immoral in their mindsets.
Mm-hmm. So there's a great cultural war going on, even though we may not think of it that way, but I think of it every time I turn the news on, all the opposition and the war, the things that are going on in our own culture that are so ungodly that are attacking Christians from that level. Yes, sir? Mm-hmm. 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 Right. So Satan is still active, isn't he? And he is doing his best to undermine and to oppose those things that God wants, that God is wanting us to do, that he has commanded us to do. So many of the things in the culture, we don't necessarily always think of it of, okay, we see these things going on, but ultimately, who's really behind it? We can say, in a lot of cases, this is Satan using different people to try to tear down God's plan, God's plan for the family, God's plan for the Christians of worship, things that God has set forth. Yet Satan continues to be active and try to thwart God's plan. But as you said, ultimately Satan will be defeated. That Christ defeated and overcame on the cross and was raised, resurrection. He was raised from the dead so that we could really have that conquering over sin and over Satan and be raised new from a spiritual standpoint, and only have to think about our physical death, but we can get to a point where our spiritual, we don't have to die spiritually because of what Christ did. So, but Satan continues to try to thwart God's plan. And as we look in the text, what did Nehemiah do when on that first round, when people started scoffing him, started being opposed? What was Nehemiah's first reaction? How did he combat that? You remember in the text? Prayer. So, that was how Nehemiah, what his example was, how he dealt with this scoffing and combating this opposition. And I think in our own lives, And in our own day, one of the first things we may need to do to combat these attacks of Satan is go to prayer, and because that's where we get our strength, and that's how we can first step in combating Satan and those things that are coming up. Then the second step that we see in our text, what happened when the Jews, the Nehemiahs, what happened when they were threatened with force? You remember they had then this threat that they were going to come in and wipe them out physically and kill them as they were going to build the wall. What was the reaction to that? Okay, preparation. Prayer was part of that. They armed themselves. He encouraged them to fight, didn't he? He told them to be watchful. To watch, to carry on with precaution against what these potential attacks would be. So, how important is prayer? We've seen his example of prayer in both of these cases. So, prayer is paramount. We see in Luke 21:36, says, "Watch therefore, and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." Colossians 4:2, "Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving." And then Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. This would apply perhaps to also, you could see the parallel in Nehemiah's time about how anxious they were and how concerned they were, and they couldn't get anything done for worrying about these attacks. So Philippians 4:6 says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving let your requests be known to God." So how do we set our guards against Satan? And how do we fight against Satan? So some of these comments are all brought into, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 6. And Johnny had mentioned arming ourselves. Ephesians chapter 6 talks about the armor of God. And as we apply that, Nehemiah had given the commands to put on the armor, have the weapons prepared to combat the physical assaults that perhaps would happen. So in this, though, section of Ephesians, Paul is telling the Ephesians how to combat the evil one, how to combat Satan, and what would be required. So he is saying then, starting verse 10, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, with which you will be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." Verse 18, "Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints. And for me, that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am ambassador in chains, that in it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak." So in Nehemiah's time, to what end were they working? They were working in building this wall, and they were working to secure the city physically as they were trying to rebuild this project and make it safe. And for us, Paul is telling us that, to what end are we working? Well, we are working He says, in spreading the gospel. We're working to build the church up. We are working to securing our spiritual salvation. You know, people in Nehemiah's time were working to secure their physical salvation by having protection from the wall. We're working toward having our spiritual salvation secured. So, in this case, we can learn a lot of things from Nehemiah as we then can cross-reference that to Paul's instructions on how we are to be watchful, how we are to gird ourselves, how we protect ourselves as we, in our day, we're fighting Satan. In Nehemiah's day, he was getting ready to fight the opposition that were trying to fight against God's command of their project. So thank you for your comments. I appreciate it. Next week, we'll be in chapter 5, if you want to read ahead there.